Now, is Russia's war economy finally starting to crack? The United States has hit Moscow where it hurts the most, its energy giants. Now, in the latest, President Vladimir Putin has said that the sanctions don't affect the Russian economy. He's also asserted that the sanctions are an unfriendly act and do not strengthen the US-Russia relations. He also interestingly now seems to be highlighting that dialogue is always better than war.
A night lit up by fireballs. Russia's latest war machine is in full display. A wave of shade, drone and missiles rain down on Kyiv and Zaporizhzhia in one of Russia's most intense bombardments ahead of the winter. Residents scramble for shelters as air defense batteries roared for the second consecutive night across Ukraine.
Around 2 a.m., I heard Shahed accelerating. I was lying on the bed at the time, not sleeping. When it hit, everything flew out. The window blocks were blown out, I hear. Glass shattered. My mother, 88 years old, was covered with glass on the couch. The balcony collapsed. The kitchen was destroyed.
As the war shows little sign of slowdown, Washington is turning up the heat. In a sharp policy shift, US President Donald Trump has hit Russia's two biggest oil companies with sanctions. The sanctions target oil giants Rosneft and Lukoil, which account for more than 5% of global oil output. The move marks dramatic U-turn by Trump just a day after he shelved his summit with Putin in Budapest.
Well, I think that in terms of honesty, the only thing I can say is every time I speak with Vladimir, I have good conversations, and then they don't go anywhere. They just don't go anywhere.
The sanctions aim to freeze Russian assets and deal a death blow to the Putin's war chest. Russian oil and gas revenue is currently down by 21% year-on-year. It accounts for around 1/4 of its budget and is the most important source of revenue for Moscow. However, Moscow's main revenue source comes from taxing output, not exports, which is likely to soften the immediate impact of the sanctions on state finances. Russia has shrugged off the likely impact of the sanctions. It calls them unproductive to end war in Ukraine.
Our country has developed a strong immunity to Western restrictions and will continue to confidently develop its economic potential, including its energy potential.
According to US estimates, Russia has spent over $250 billion since the start of the war in 2022. The Kremlin has splurged on weapons, factories. It has increased its trade with China to evade Western sanctions. Over the past 3 years, the Russian economy has outperformed most forecasts. Today, Russia is world's most sanctioned nation. US, along with its European allies, has imposed over 25,000 sanctions on Russia. Now, slowly, the Russian economy is feeling the pinch, despite absorbing the blow of the sanctions and showing resilience. Moscow is staring at a deficit of around $100 billion in 2026. Experts believe Trump, frustrated with the long-drawn war, is employing his most efficient tools, sanctions and tariffs.
I mean, to a certain extent, the ball is now in Moscow court. I mean, Moscow can have two options. One, Moscow can decide to do nothing and keep the position totally unchanged, hoping that China and particularly China will bankroll Moscow by buying most of its energy. Or Moscow can decide that the pain is getting too big and then move towards some sort of a settlement.
As fighting intensifies and sanctions bite deeper, the question remains, can Moscow's war economy survive another year of Western pressure? Trump has made his most decisive move against Moscow. Can Putin outsmart his American counterpart again?
All right, now joining us on the broadcast, we've got Mr. Fred Weir, who is a senior journalist and a political commentator. And Mr. Fred Weir, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on WION. Now, this of course, is a very critical moment in the conversations between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. So far, what we've witnessed is that there were a series of phone calls. There was this big summit in Alaska. The other summit in Budapest was now put off. It does appear that Donald Trump is losing patience with Vladimir Putin and has now hit Russia with these crippling sanctions. In your assessment, to what extent do these sanctions affect the Russian economy, and how does this change the Russian position in the Ukraine war?
Well, there are two different questions there. One is whether Russia would succumb to any amount of pressure. And in that press conference, Putin said no. I think that does reflect Russian history, the Russian character, and many countries, most countries. He said no country will buckle under outside pressure. And that's certainly probably true, that even if the sanctions are hitting Russia hard and people are suffering, Russia's not going to change its military calculus. The second question is, how bad are the sanctions? And from where I sit, I don't see a lot of impact. I mean, I live in the Russian consumer economy.
Right.
And if there was serious strain on the military economy, you'd see rationing, you'd see shortages, you'd see things that show that priority for the military is hurting civilians. I really don't see that. But who knows? Maybe, this is the 19th round of EU sanctions on Russia. Maybe 19 is a charm. Maybe that's the one that will win. These sanctions against Russian oil companies, as Putin said, probably won't have much effect. But there in India, you need to ask, are you going to stop buying Russian oil? Because I think that would hurt Russian income, Russian revenues. There are questions and there are ways that Russia can be hurt. I'm quite sure that the most intense barrage of sanctions ever leveled against the country in all of history must be having some effect, but it isn't clearly having any effect on Russian war policy. And so far, I see very little impact on the lives of ordinary Russians.
The impact of these sanctions that have been imposed by the American president will, of course, be witnessed in the forthcoming weeks and months. But I also want you to weigh in on what the Russian president has now said, where he's now said that dialogue is always better than war. And also what the American president is now saying, that every time he talks to Putin, a lot of nice things are said, but very little gets done. And therefore, his approach to the Ukraine war appears to have now changed, at least substantially. In your assessment, how different do you think Donald Trump would be approaching any negotiations with Russia henceforth?
I honestly don't know. I think the Russians certainly say that they have had one and the same set of war goals, and they have made them very clear from the very beginning that in Alaska, Trump was told by Putin on what terms he would declare a full ceasefire, and that involved giving up the whole Donbass to Russia, accepting Ukrainian neutrality, a measure of demilitarization, and so on. The list is well known. Right. This is a long-standing list issued by the Russians, and it's Trump's flipping and flopping that is mysterious here. He's either Putin is telling him something completely different over the telephone than what Putin is saying publicly, or Trump is hearing different things or trying to negotiate with all these bombastic changes of position. I just don't know. But certainly the Russians claim they want dialogue with the U.S. They regard that as very important. And I think we'll have to wait and see whether that can continue.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Mr. Fredvier, for joining us from Moscow and getting us that perspective there about how Russia now views this changed stance by Donald Trump.